devotional study from the book of Job as we continue looking at the question of suffering. I'm Pastor Greg Bing of Grace Bible Church in Fort Worth, Texas, and happy to have you with us today as we continue our studies in God's Word. In our last study, we saw Bildad's third and final speech recorded in Job chapter 25. Only 6 verses because there really wasn't much left for him to say. And he was the last of the friends to speak. We saw Job's response also, specifically to Bildad's words in Job chapter 26. Today we move on and we examine Job's words that bring really to a close this dialogue between him and his 3 friends. This is his final response specifically to this group of people, and we find that in Job chapter 27. We read in the first 6 verses, it says this, "Moreover, Job continued his discourse and said, As God lives, who has taken away my justice, and the Almighty, who has made my soul bitter, as long as my breath is in me, and the breath of God is in my nostrils, my lips will not speak wickedness, nor my tongue utter deceit. Far be it from me that I should say you are right. Until I die, I will not put away my integrity from me. My righteousness I hold fast, and will not let it go. My heart shall not reproach me as long as I live." Job reiterates his unwavering stance that he remains righteous, having committed no wickedness and no sin that would bring about the severe sufferings he's going through. He swears an oath there in verse 2 to the living God. This is kind of an extreme measure to swear to God and to assert that his righteousness is intact. By swearing to God, there are grave consequences if he's lying, but this is sort of a last resort for him to try to get across to him that I'm telling the truth, that this is absolutely true. I maintained my righteousness. He says, "I do this though God has taken away his justice, and though the Almighty has severely afflicted him. He has made me bitter in my soul and anguish. I still swear before the living God that I have maintained my righteousness." When he says, "taken away my justice," Job is not accusing God of being unrighteous. He's simply saying he hasn't had a chance to have his day in court, to make his plea to God and to hear the charges that God has against him. Job says in verse 3, "As long as I live," as long as there's breath in my body. He stresses that 4 times in this passage. Verse 2 a couple of times, verse 5, verse 6. He says in verse 4, "I will not speak wickedness. I will not utter deceit." Now, he believes it would be wicked if he agreed with his friends, if he said he had done some sin when he hadn't. He says, "I will never say that you are right in saying that I've sinned, that I deserve what I'm getting. I will not put away my integrity." They claim that Job's sticking to this idea that he was righteous was an evidence that he was a hypocrite, that he was a liar and a hypocrite. He says, "I will maintain my integrity." And see, he vows in verse 6, "My righteousness, I'm going to hold fast to that. I will not let go of it. My heart will not reproach, it will not rebuke me, because I know I haven't done anything deserving of these judgments." In verses 7 through 12, Job, in the form of an imprecation, a curse, he warns his 3 friends that their opposition to him and their accusations against him bring them into possible judgment from God, because he is a righteous man. These are false accusations. And he says in verse 7, "May my enemy be like the wicked." Now, his enemy is not God. He's not talking about God. He's not talking about Satan. That he hasn't come into play in all this. He's talking about his 3 friends. He says, "May my enemy be like the wicked, and he who rises up against me," again, his 3 friends, may they be like the unrighteous. For what's the hope of the hypocrite? Though he may gain much, if God takes away his life. So he's sort of saying that let this curse be upon you. If you continue to maintain that I've done wicked or sinful, that these are false accusations. May you be judged like the wicked, because that's a wicked thing to do. Bringing a curse upon someone seems kind of strange to us, but this was an accepted practice at that particular time. It was an honorable way to defend yourself against false accusations and to declare that you trusted in God to carry out justice. In verses 8 through 10, the imprecation continues, the curse, against those that were truly guilty of hypocrisy. He says, what's the hope of the hypocrite? He says, you may gain much in this life, but you lose your life. It's like what Jesus said. What does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And so Job says in verse 11, I will teach you about the hand of God. Let me tell you how God works, how his power is put forth. What is with the Almighty, I will not conceal. He's warning his friends that you may fall into judgment. You may fall into judgment yourselves because of what you're saying about me. So he says in verse 12, he goes on and he says, surely all of you have seen it. He says, why then do you behave with complete nonsense? Why do you just give this meaningless and this empty talk to me when you know that there's a danger of judgment to those who do wickedly, who make false accusations against those who are righteous? And so he's warning them. In verses 13 through 23, Job reminds them of what they know and what they've contended all along. The sure fate of the wicked at the hands of Almighty God. The judgment that God brings upon them. He says in verse 13, this is the portion of a wicked man with God, and the heritage of oppressors received from the Almighty. This is what's going to happen to the wicked. This is what's going to happen to those who oppress those who are weak and those who are helpless. And so he says, this is what you're going to receive. And then in verses 14 through 21, Job briefly surveys the punishment that's reserved for the wicked. Job definitely believes that the wicked will be judged by God. He just doesn't necessarily believe it will always happen in this life. It may happen at the judgment, but not necessarily in this life. He says there'll be judgment and punishment upon the family of the wicked. There'll be loss of wealth and the possessions of the wicked. There will be loss of safety and peace of men, terrors that overtake them like a flood. They will be carried away and destroyed like the east wind carries something away until it's absolutely gone. In the last two verses of this chapter, we see really the Hebrew seems to close this section out in the same way that began it. At the hand of God at work, at the portion allotted by God to the wicked, we see that destruction is hurled against him by his God. It says it hurls against him and it does not spare. There's no mercy. He says he flees desperately from his power, from the power of his hand, literally. He says, and he shall clap his hands at him and shall hiss him out of his place. I think these are talking about things that God will do. God will bring destruction against him and not spare him, meaning the wicked. He will flee. The wicked will flee from the hand of God, but not be able to. He shall, and God, it says, shall clap hands at him and hiss him out of his place. That reminds me of what we read in Psalm 2, verse 4, where it says, he who sits in the heavens shall laugh. The Lord shall hold him in derision. God will, in a sense, laugh at man's attempts to stand against him and to believe that he can do whatever he wants, and God will not judge him. From there, we move on to Job chapter 28, and it describes man's pursuit of wisdom. Beautiful chapter, beautiful verses that are used to describe this pursuit of wisdom. There are those who question who really speaks these words. It's really unclear from the Hebrew. Nobody is actually identified at the very beginning of the chapter. Certainly, I don't believe it's one of Job's friends. Some believe it is. Some believe this is Zophar's words. Some question if it's Job either, because if it is, there's a great spiritual insight that we find in this chapter from whoever is speaking. So some believe that it's the writer of the book or the narrator, if that was not Job. They think that this shows too much spiritual insight for Job to have it this early. Really don't know. But the subject is this: how can man find the wisdom of God? And we see it broken down into two parts. Verses 1 through 11, we see he describes how man mines the earth for valuable metals and precious stones. And he uses that as an example in verses 12 through 28 of mining for wisdom. Something that's even more valuable than the riches of this world, which is what Job and his friends have really been seeking in this whole discussion, is trying to find wisdom and understanding. Verses 1 through 11 describes again man's methods for mining metals and precious stones from the earth, talking about all the things that man will do, searching for the right place, using light to search out every recess, opening shafts in faraway places where they'll be undisturbed. These are places where birds and animals don't even trod, digging and cutting out channels and rocks, even damaging up streams that trickle along and cover up certain hidden gems. They do everything they can to bring it out, and that's used as an example. In verse 12, the question comes up at this ask, but where can wisdom be found? And where is the place of understanding? Man does not know its value, nor is it found in the land of the living. This is what Job longs for, to understand why, God, why has this happened? Wisdom and understanding. And so we see that he uses mining as an example of the fact that we need to go to every extent possible. But where can we go? Where can we find wisdom? Verse 13 says, man doesn't know where it's found. Man doesn't know its value. It's not found in the land of the living. It's not found in our lives here upon this earth. That's not where wisdom is. It's not in the ocean depths. It's not in the seas. Can't be purchased for gold or weighed against silver. Its value far exceeds precious metals and stones. Proverbs chapter 3, verses 13 through 15 says this, happy is the man who finds wisdom, and the man who gains understanding. For her proceeds are better than the profits of silver, and her gain than fine gold. She is more precious than rubies, and all the things you may desire cannot compare with her. That's what we're searching for, something that's more valuable than anything on this earth. In verse 20, the question is asked, from where then does wisdom come? Where does it come from? And where is the place of understanding? It's hidden from the eyes of all those who are living. It's concealed from the birds of the air. Destruction and death say, we have heard reports of it, but they don't know where it is. Verse 23 tells us this. It says, God understands its way, and only God. God knows its place, for he looks to the ends of the earth. He sees under the whole heavens. He establishes the proper measures for the winds and the water. He makes laws to govern the rains and the thunderstorms. And by doing all of this, we see in verse 27, it says, in doing this, God sees wisdom. God saw wisdom, and he declared it. He prepared it. Indeed, he searched it out. God knows and works with wisdom. In verse 28, we see the conclusion. And to man, God says this, behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. And to depart from evil, that's understanding. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom. To depart from evil is understanding. This is something Solomon says himself in the first chapter of Proverbs. Proverbs chapter 1, verse 7. It says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. You know, Job has made that good beginning already. Fearing the Lord and shunning evil. Things that God acknowledged in Job chapters 1 and 2 and will acknowledge again at the end of the book. Job's three friends are more like what we see in this verse. He says, fools. He says, fools despise wisdom and instruction. And that's really what those three friends have demonstrated. Job appreciates and fears the Lord, but they don't really. And they won't learn from or listen to the wisdom or instruction of anyone, not from God and not from Job. In our next study, we look at Job chapters 29 through 31, the last things he speaks before another man, Elihu, speaks. And then in these verses, we'll find Job's final complaint and his final defense. And I hope that you'll join us next time as we continue studying in the book of Job.